The sound of the mail slot clinking echoed through the hallway as Emma bent down to retrieve the envelope. She already knew what it was before she opened it. Another wedding. Another reminder. She turned the stiff, glossy card over in her hands. The names of her younger sister and soon-to-be brother-in-law printed in gold letters. No warm note inside. Just the details, the formality. No phone call, no excitement shared. She wasn't family, she was a courtesy. Emma sat on the worn couch in her small apartment, her fingers tracing the edges of the invite. The familiar sting welled up in her chest, heavier this time. How many weddings had she stood outside of, watching from the background as her siblings twirled under fairy lights, toasted champagne, posed for family portraits. Ones she was never truly part of. She was always there, technically. In the group photos, somewhere on the edge, smiling too hard to hide how out of place she felt. Her phone buzzed on the table. A family group message. Jokes about the upcoming wedding, excitement filling the chat. Emma stared at the screen for a long minute before turning it face down, without replying. She had learned long ago that her silence was safer than her honesty. A memory flickered. Years ago, at her brother's wedding, standing by herself while relatives she barely knew were ushered into group pictures. The way her mother had waved her away absent-mindedly, saying, "Let's just get siblings and close family first." As if she was something else. Something less. Emma wiped the corner of her eye and laughed bitterly under her breath. It wasn't the invite that hurt the most. It was the consistency. Every time she hoped for something different, she was reminded exactly where she stood. And now, as she held the latest proof between her hands, something inside her didn't just ache, it hardened. She wouldn't cry this time. She wouldn't beg for inclusion with polite texts or guilty calls. No more pretending that a chair at the back of the reception was enough. No more convincing herself that love meant patience, that family ties excused indifference. Emma folded the invitation carefully and slid it back into its envelope. She placed it in a drawer alongside others she had never thrown away, each one a silent testimony to years of trying to matter. As she closed the drawer with a soft click, she felt the beginning of something stir inside her. Not rage, not bitterness, but resolve. She didn't know what shape her future would take, but one thing was clear. She was done asking for space in lives that had long closed their doors to her. One day, it would be her turn to celebrate something beautiful, something sacred. And when that day came, she would choose differently. Not out of spite, but out of peace. A peace she was just beginning to taste, even in her quiet heartbreak. Emma leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the silence around her heavy, yet comforting. For the first time in years, she realized her story wasn't ending here. It was just beginning. The kitchen always smelled like fresh bread when Emma was little. She would sit on the counter swinging her legs, watching her mother knead dough with practiced hands. It was one of the few places she felt truly seen. Before life got complicated, before being the quiet one meant being forgotten, Emma and her brother, Daniel, were close once, or at least that's how it looked to others. Daniel was the golden child, confident, charismatic, always a step ahead. Teachers adored him. Relatives bragged about him. It was easy to bask in his glow when they were young, but as the years stretched on, the difference between them sharpened like a blade. His successes became milestones the family celebrated. Emma's quiet efforts barely rippled the surface. She remembered her high school graduation clearly. Daniel had just landed an internship with a prestigious law firm, and her parents spent the evening talking about his bright future, while Emma sat silently at the corner of the dinner table, her diploma tucked under her chair like an afterthought. It wasn't that she failed. Emma had dreams too, small at first, like owning a little cafe where people felt like family. But dreams needed air to breathe, and hers often suffocated under the heavy blanket of comparison. Every birthday, every holiday, every minor success was dimmed by the constant, unspoken question, why couldn't she be more like Daniel? She learned early to stop explaining herself. Instead, she started building in silence, saving bits of her paycheck from a string of odd jobs, sketching out business plans on napkins during lunch breaks, reading articles late into the night after long shifts, her eyes burning but her heart steady. Opening her first restaurant hadn't been a grand event. There were no big announcements, No proud family dinners to toast her achievement. Just her, standing in the doorway of a tiny rented space. Keys in one hand, paint-stained jeans on her legs, heart pounding with a mix of terror and hope. Emma poured everything into that restaurant. The hours were brutal. Sometimes she barely slept, barely ate. Her hands cracked from scrubbing floors herself to save money. There were months she didn't know if she'd make rent. Nights she cried quietly into her pillow so no one would hear how close she was to breaking. But through all of it, she never called home to complain. She never asked for help, never tried to explain what she was chasing. She knew what the answer would be: polite confusion, maybe a few patronizing words about real careers, followed by more stories of Daniel's latest promotion. Each sacrifice added a layer of quiet strength inside her. She was no longer the girl who waited for applause that never came. She was becoming someone else, someone who understood that worth wasn't handed to you. It had to be carved out, piece by painful piece, from a world that rarely cared. And Emma was willing to carve until her hands bled if she had to. The family gatherings became harder to sit through over the years. Emma had mastered the art of smiling without speaking, clapping politely when Daniel announced yet another achievement. His voice always carried over the room, filling the space with a certainty Emma could never fake. Thanksgiving at her parents' house was always the worst. This particular year, the turkey sat dry and untouched on her plate as Daniel regaled everyone with tales from his new promotion. He wore a tailored suit, an expensive watch glinting under the chandelier light, while Emma sat in her plain dress, feeling smaller with each laugh at his jokes. At one point, between dessert and coffee, Daniel turned toward her, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "So, Emma," he said loudly, making sure everyone heard, "still flipping burgers at that little restaurant of yours?" The table erupted into a few awkward chuckles. Even their mother gave a tight, uncomfortable smile, looking anywhere but at Emma. For a split second, Emma couldn't breathe. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks, 1,000 retorts rushing to her throat, clawing for escape. She could have listed every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every customer she treated like family. She could have shouted that owning something, building it with her bare hands, meant more than any corner office ever could. But she didn't. She simply set her fork down quietly, folded her napkin, and smiled, a real smile this time. One that didn't seek their approval. One that said, "I hear you, and I'm done needing your applause." Inside, though, something shifted. His words didn't just sting, they etched themselves into her bones. Emma realized then that no matter how hard she worked, her family would always measure her against Daniel's yardstick. It wasn't about success. It was about the story they chose to believe. That night, lying awake in her childhood bed, surrounded by old posters and forgotten trophies, Emma made herself a promise. She wouldn't waste energy proving them wrong with words. She would let her actions speak so loudly, so undeniably, that even their silence would crumble under the weight of her truth. The betrayal wasn't the mockery itself. It was the realization that the people she loved most never really saw her. They only saw the outline of what they expected her to be. Quieter, smaller, invisible. Emma knew revenge, fueled by anger, would burn her out. She didn't want to be bitter. She didn't want to become a reflection of their cruelty. She wanted something deeper, something permanent. She wanted peace. And she would find it, not by shouting back across the table, but by rising so far beyond their reach that one day they'd sit at someone else's dinner table, whispering her name with a regret too heavy to bear. That night marked a quiet ending and an even quieter beginning. The months that followed were some of the hardest of Emma's life. While Daniel enjoyed corporate lunches and luxury vacations, Emma was working 16-hour days, pouring herself into the tiny restaurant most of her family barely acknowledged. At first, growth came in tiny, almost invisible increments. A new espresso machine, a handful of regulars who started bringing friends, a glowing online review that brought in a trickle of new customers. Emma learned quickly that dreams weren't built by giant leaps. They were shaped, painfully and slowly, by the small choices made every single day. There were sacrifices, too, brutal ones. She missed birthdays, weddings, even funerals. Relationships wilted under the constant demands of her business. There were nights when Emma sat alone at a corner table after closing, staring at the empty chairs, wondering if all the loneliness was even worth it. Doubt crept in like a bitter cold. Was she chasing a future that didn't exist? Was Daniel right? Maybe all she'd ever have was this, a small, struggling restaurant no one cared about. But every time those thoughts tried to take root, Emma remembered that Thanksgiving. She remembered the smirk on Daniel's face, the way their mother had looked at her with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. She remembered how small she had felt, and how badly she never wanted to feel that way again. So she kept going. Emma read every book on business she could get her hands on. She took night courses in finance and marketing. She studied restaurant management like it was a life or death science. While her classmates were out celebrating promotions, she was designing new menus, negotiating with suppliers, and learning the brutal realities of running a business. Slowly, the restaurant transformed. She renovated the interiors, creating an elegant, welcoming atmosphere that made people linger. She hired a brilliant young chef who understood Emma's vision and elevated the cuisine. Word started to spread beyond her little town. Food bloggers visited. A local magazine featured her on the cover. And then came the real breakthrough, an opportunity to buy the neighboring property. It was a massive risk. Emma would have to mortgage everything she had, take out loans she wasn't even sure she'd qualify for. Failure wasn't just possible, it was likely. But Emma didn't hesitate. She signed the papers with trembling hands, staking her future on her own belief in herself, the same belief her family never had. Standing in front of the empty lot that would soon become her second restaurant, Emma felt something deep inside her shift. She wasn't that insecure girl sitting silently at a dinner table anymore. She was building something real, something permanent. And it was all hers. The sacrifices hadn't broken her. They had forged her. Emma understood now. True growth was quiet. It didn't need applause or permission. It only needed relentless faith. And she was just getting started. The day of reckoning came like any other ordinary day, except fate had woven a very different script behind the scenes. Emma stood at the front of her newly expanded fine dining restaurant, dressed in a sleek black dress, her hair neatly pinned up. The atmosphere buzzed with the soft murmur of conversation, clinking glasses, and the comforting notes of a live piano. Her staff moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Every detail was polished to perfection, just the way Emma had envisioned it when she used to sit alone dreaming after those long nights of cleaning dishes. She was adjusting a floral arrangement at the entrance when the glass doors swung open. A familiar voice echoed through the space. Emma's heart skipped. It was Daniel. But he wasn't alone. Behind him strode a tall man in an expensive suit, Daniel's company's biggest client. Emma recognized him from a local business magazine feature. Apparently, Daniel had been desperate to impress this client to land a multi-million-dollar deal that could make or break his position at the firm. Emma's fingers froze around the vase. Daniel hadn't noticed her yet. He was too busy laughing loudly, gesturing around, boasting about knowing the best spots in town. His voice carried easily across the restaurant, drawing a few glances. "This is the hidden gem I told you about," Daniel bragged. "I know the owner personally." Emma didn't move. She simply watched from the side, her expression composed, her presence unnoticed for now, just the way she wanted it. The maitre d', trained to perfection, greeted Daniel with professional warmth. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Le Jardin. Do you have a reservation?" Daniel chuckled, waving dismissively. "No need. The owner's my family. Emma. Emma something, right?" He turned, scanning the room lazily. His eyes landed on her. For a fraction of a second, confusion flickered across his face. Then came the slow, dawning horror. Emma stepped forward slowly, a polite but distant smile on her lips. "Good evening, Daniel." The client turned too, curious, sensing the sudden shift in Daniel's demeanor. "You know the owner personally?" the client asked, impressed. Daniel swallowed hard. Yes. She's, my sister." Emma inclined her head gracefully. "Actually, I'm the sole owner of this restaurant." "And," she said calmly, "the building's on this block." The client raised his eyebrows, clearly even more impressed now. He turned to Emma, eager to shake her hand. Meanwhile, Daniel stood frozen, a faint flush creeping up his neck. The mask of superiority he always wore was slipping, piece by piece. Emma didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply guided the client and Daniel to a private table, treating them no differently than any other guests. Professional, courteous, and absolutely in control. Daniel struggled through the dinner, his words fumbling, his laughter forced. Every time he looked at Emma, he was reminded, silently and painfully, that the small restaurant he once mocked had blossomed into something he could never claim and never touch. Emma had said nothing cruel. She hadn't needed to. Her success spoke louder than anything she ever could. Emma moved through the restaurant with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. She checked on her guests, smiled gently at the servers, and offered a kind word to the kitchen staff. Every movement, every word, was wrapped in calm dignity. Daniel sat stiffly at the private table, his client deep in conversation with Emma, praising the elegance of the place. Daniel forced a tight smile, but Emma could see the panic behind his eyes. She could feel it, the silent collapse of his ego. And yet, she remained composed, not a single word of accusation passing her lips. That was the most powerful part. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic scenes. Only silence. A silence filled with the heavy weight of truth. As Emma returned to the table with a personalized dessert, something she designed herself, Daniel attempted a strained laugh. "I guess you really turned things around, huh?" Emma simply smiled, her expression unreadable. "I guess so." No bitterness, no smugness, just calm acknowledgement. Inside, Emma felt a strange peace settle over her. She had spent years carrying the burden of feeling less than, of thinking she needed to explain herself or fight for recognition. But standing there, watching Daniel squirm under the weight of his own actions, she realized she didn't owe anyone anything anymore. The client leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed. "You know," he said to Daniel, "if you had mentioned your sister's empire earlier, it would have made tonight's negotiations much easier." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no words. Emma excused herself with grace, leaving them to their meal. She didn't hover. She didn't wait for Daniel to apologize. She didn't need it. Her entire being radiated a message louder than any speech she could have given. "I built this without your support, and I don't need your validation now." Later, when Daniel caught her alone near the wine cellar, his voice was low, almost pleading. "Emma, listen, about before? I never meant to." Emma looked at him steadily, her brown eyes warm but distant. "It's okay, Daniel," she said softly. "You don't have to explain." And she meant it. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for herself. She had no interest in reopening old wounds, no desire to make him squirm more than he already was. She simply chose to rise above it, leaving him trapped in the mess of his own regret. Daniel nodded awkwardly, looking everywhere but at her. He was hoping for an easy fix, a way to erase the years of mockery with a few clumsy words. But some things couldn't be undone by apologies. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. Emma smiled once more, then turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly on the polished floors. Silence, dignity, strength. That was her revenge. And it was far more satisfying than any shouting match could have ever been. That night, after the last guests had left and the staff had begun cleaning up, Emma sat alone in the corner of her restaurant, a glass of water in her hand. The soft glow of the chandeliers cast golden reflections across the polished tables. She leaned back and closed her eyes, letting the stillness wash over her. It was over. Not just the evening, but something much deeper. A chapter she hadn't even realized she was still carrying inside her. Emma thought back to the little girl she once was, the one who had always trailed behind Daniel, who had been told to be more like him, to think bigger, to know her place. She had spent so many years tangled in invisible chains, desperate for approval from people who never cared enough to see her worth. And yet here she was, not because they finally saw her, but because she stopped waiting for them to. A bittersweet smile tugged at Emma's lips. She had built her success out of quiet mornings and sleepless nights, out of the sacrifices nobody ever saw, the tears shed in the back rooms of failing businesses, the dreams whispered into the darkness when everyone else had given up on her. She remembered the loneliness, the moments of doubt, the days when even she questioned whether her dreams were foolish. But somehow, someway, she had kept going. Tonight wasn't just about showing Daniel or her family how wrong they were. It wasn't even about proving anything anymore. It was about realizing that the approval she had craved all her life was meaningless compared to the pride she now felt in herself. Emma no longer needed them to see her. She saw herself. The woman who had once stood silent under her brother's mocking laughter was gone. In her place stood someone unshakable, someone who knew her own worth. Not because it had been handed to her, but because she had carved it out of stone with her own hands. There was no anger left, no lingering bitterness. Only a quiet, powerful sense of peace. She thought about Daniel's awkward apology, his downcast eyes, his struggle to bridge a gap he had created with years of condescension. For a brief moment, Emma felt a flicker of pity for him. Not anger, just sadness for how much he had lost by never truly seeing her. She lifted her glass in a quiet toast to herself, to the journey, to the strength born out of silence, to the woman who had once been invisible, and who now owned the very block she was once laughed at for dreaming about. In that moment, Emma realized that true success wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making them regret it. It was about never needing them to matter at all. She placed the empty glass on the table, stood up, and walked across her restaurant, her empire, with a grace that came from surviving what should have broken her. The transformation was complete. Emma was free. The days that followed were strangely quiet. Emma couldn't help but reflect on the shift that had taken place. She had expected some form of closure after the encounter with Daniel. But the truth was, what she felt wasn't satisfaction. It was a profound sense of peace. There was no bitterness, no lingering desire for revenge. What had once felt like an insurmountable obstacle in her life had, with time, melted away into a distant memory. Daniel reached out a few days later. His message was terse and apologetic, but it was too little, too late. Emma didn't need to hear his words. The apology felt hollow, like a bandage over a wound that had already healed. Her phone buzzed with another text, then another, and yet Emma didn't feel the urge to respond. His regret wasn't hers to accept. The truth was, it didn't matter anymore. She had long since stopped looking for validation from those who never saw her. His attempts to reconnect felt like a faint echo of a life she no longer wanted to revisit. Emma was finally free. The restaurant had become more than a business. It was the symbol of her freedom, of the woman she had become in the face of neglect and disrespect. With every dish served, with every guest welcomed, she reclaimed a piece of her dignity. It was a new beginning, not just for her career, but for her entire life. Looking out the window of her office, Emma watched as the sun dipped below the horizon. The city buzzed below, its pulse strong and unrelenting, just like the strength that now beat in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged to herself. No longer defined by her family's expectations, no longer bound by the labels they had tried to place on her. She was Emma, the woman who had dreamed, the woman who had fought, the woman who had won. And it felt good. As the last rays of sunlight touched the skyline, Emma smiled softly to herself. She had come full circle. The woman who once stood at the mercy of her family's harsh judgment had now become a force in her own right. Her business, her life, her future, they were all hers to shape. And no one, least of all her brother, could take that from her. "Sometimes the loudest revenge is silence," she whispered to herself, the words floating in the air like a secret only she knew. Silence had been her strength, her weapon, and her salvation. There was no need for anything more. No need for apologies, no need for explanations. The life she had created spoke louder than any words could. Emma had forged her path, and she would walk it with her head held high, knowing that true peace comes not from what others give you, but from what you take for yourself. And so the final chapter closed, not with a bang, but with a quiet, resolute peace.